Good afternoon, everybody. I think we usually start at University of Toronto at 5 to 10 after, but that's not necessary. We've got people online, we've got people in person. My name is Robert Austin. I'm the Associate Director of SARIS here at the London School and a Professor of History, largely. You have all probably seen Peter's bio, which we posted online, so I'm not going to spend too much time. But by way of an introduction for Peter, I would rather just tell you a couple of personal things. I think are shed as much light as a bio does. I met Peter probably. Yeah, don't. I met Peter probably a decade ago, and I met him because a student of ours a long time ago, Marie Macaulay, you remember her, found this internship for herself, and it was at Political Capital, which is a think tank in Budapest, and it proved to be a very great placement for a young person, and she's gone on to great things. But out of that internship, which, as I said, she discovered, I met Peter, and we became what you say is fast friends. And we developed a really nice relationship. He's been here a couple of times. But just a couple of things. Political Capital for me is one of the best think tanks in Central Europe. It goes without saying. And the type of work that is produced out of Political Capital is exceptional. And as important, the type of experience that Political Capital provides for our students has proven to be exceptional. So Peter's a friend on an intellectual level, but delivering practical projects for our students around here. For those of you who read leading newspapers, so I'm talking about Financial Times, New York Times, Guardian, etc., and I'm talking about English language papers, of course, you'll note that if you want to understand contemporary Hungary, and you read those papers, the person you'll most often come across in the newspapers is Peter. And that's just really impressive. And I like reading when my friends appear in the newspaper. I think it's really nice to see that. But Peter has been a really exceptional analyst of events in Budapest and in Hungary. But moreover, he's really, to me, the top specialist more broadly on Central Europe, which is the topic of our conversation today. And again, I think this is your third or fourth visit here.
I think fourth.
Fourth. Okay, so you can see that it's been immensely valuable to this center. And Peter also, in his career, when you look at his work, and Ava has his book somewhere there. I think she just had it signed.
The office.
Yeah. But Peter,
you want me to bring it?
No, it's okay. But we should have probably done a book launch too. But you'll come next time, and we'll do a book launch for another book, if that's all right with you. You have to write another one though.
Well, I'm just starting.
Very good.
After we finish.
Okay, very good. But this is the book, The Hungarian Far Right, correct? That's the one you correct, Ava?
Yeah, that's the one I have. Yeah.
But Peter's research. You've got a chance to talk to a person who's a political scientist, but he's also a social psychologist. So he brings together this kind of interdisciplinarity that the Monk School really prioritizes, because that's our thing here is that, I'm a historian, but I teach in political science. And Peter has wedded these two fields, and also his capacity to understand something that is in some ways ununderstandable, which is disinformation, okay, which is going to be one of the themes for today. So again, aside from this terrific bio and a really terrific person, for me, it's a pleasure for him to be here. The last thing I'll say about him is I brought him here. He's here for 2 weeks. Tomorrow is his last day. Saturday is his last day. He taught a course here because I believe strongly that students benefit as much from academics like me as they do from people who are real practitioners. And Peter's experience on the ground, I think, has brought an enormous amount of value. I've talked to a number of students who have taken his class. It's a short workshop, about 12 hours of instruction, but it's been an incredible experience for students. And I know that they've gained a lot. And just as important as they've made a very good connection and a contact in Hungary, because I think Hungary, Anna Porter, Steffi, all our friends know Hungary's a bit, let's say it's at a turning point, but it's been at a turning point for a while, so I'm being generous.
200 years.
Okay. 200 years. That's good. I like that. Or what A.G.P. Taylor said about Germany in 1848 when he said, Germany reached a turning point, but failed to turn. This is actually, there's a number of countries in Europe you could say that about, that reach turning points, but then nothing happens. Okay. So Anna, you might be onto something there, but I'm going to use it and claim it's my own. Okay. Having said that, Peter, Peter's going to talk for about 45 minutes. And then we're going to go to Q&A, and our plan is it says 7 o'clock, but this is a U of T thing about using 2-hour blocks. Our goal is to wrap up and let Peter off the hook at around 6:40. Does that sound about right?
Yes.
Because he's been talking about sharp power and influence of Russia and Central Europe now for probably 168 hours. So this will be Not your last hurrah, but it's close. So ladies and gentlemen, for me, great pleasure to have a dear friend back in Toronto, and I turn the floor over to you, and then I'll moderate the Q&A if you need me.
Yeah.
So I clap now.
We have tradition. So thanks a lot, Robert, and this is Toronto is probably the city that I like the most in Northern America. And it's always great to come here, and I have to tell it's I don't know what the students think about my lecture, but from a selfish perspective, I like it a lot. So I learn as well. I think at least as much from them than they from me. Really active, really. So I think the group of students who Ceres could select, I think, are really exceptional in terms of how prepared they are and how active they are and how curious they are about the topics that we discussed during the course. So I just realized, but I corrected the mistake that in the first word of the presentation there was a typo, but it speaks now. And so what I'm going to talk about, and Robert was kind in the introduction to point on that it is really an interdisciplinary exercise to talk about sharp power influence of Russia in Central and Eastern Europe, but bit broader in the Western world as well, which can sound like a bit of outdated topic in the sense that we are a bit beyond soft and sharp power conflicts. Unfortunately, we are living through history and hard power conflicts, but I will argue at the end that this topic still has a relevance. I will focus on three main subtopics in the concept of sharp power that I will explain what the hell it is, mimicking authoritarian inflation and conspiracy theories. Yes, so first I will tell a bit about the concept of sharp power and how we can differentiate it between from the soft power and from hard power. What's the advantage of this concept and how is it applicable to Russian foreign policy. Then I will talk about, as I said, mimicking conspiracy theories, authoritarian inflation. I will explain also what do these mean, some lessons to be learned from us social scientists in general, but also for the policy community and some recommendations. So first of all, let's start with, I think most of you must be familiar with this concept, so it's just a bit of repetition. What is hard power, first of all? This is what, this was a counterpoint of soft power when the term born in the early 90s. So hard power is the ability to alter the behavior of others and reach the desired outcome even against their will. So Max Weber's classical definition is that you have power if you can impose your will on others, even if they don't want to. And hard power, according to Joseph Nye's definition, he defined soft power as well, the ability, or he mostly invented the term, the ability to use the carrots and sticks of economy and military might to make others follow your will. So it's like about military and economic influence. The interesting thing is that if we take a look at the hard power of Russia, and I'm right now talking about pre-invasion, it has already been shrinking quite a lot. So Russia was, even at the beginning of this year, before the invasion, not among the 10 biggest economies in the world. And its economy, Russia's economy, has been smaller than of Italy, for example. At the same time, it is regarded to be as a much more powerful player. Also, the economy of Russia is still not on the level, and they will be probably more, will be more and more under the level of the size of the economy back to, for example, 2030. So the situation really does not look well when it comes to the economic, and of course it will go further. When it comes to military expenditures, Russia has the, in terms of annual military military expenditures back to 2020, Russia spent less than 10 times, 1/10 of what the United States spends on its military on an annual basis. Still, if you ask people in Central and Eastern Europe, some of them, and you will see it in the figures, think that the army of Russia is simply more powerful than of the United States. It's nowhere to be close. Russia's army is small. Russia spends annually less on its military, much less than China and even less than India, or spent before the invasion. Also, when it comes to the energy export of Russia to Europe, back to 2020, it was considerable, but it was only 1/4 of the energy consumption of the European Union. Again, if you take a look at the policy discourses back to 2020 in Europe, everyone was talking about no. We receive most of our energy from Russia, especially in a German-dominated discourse, and therefore, any attempts to reduce this interconnection would be a suicide. Let's build other pipelines such as Nordstrom 2 to make energy security of Europe stronger through Russia. Right now, this is less than 1/10 of the energy consumption that is of European Union that comes from Russia. So, if we take a look at the overall hard power, let's say landscape, hard power picture of Russia was not very strong. Russia was not as strong in terms of hard power as we usually tend to think. In terms of soft power, so what is soft power? Is the ability of a country to persuade others, not through economy, not through military, not through direct force or coercion, but with attraction. So soft power is again about being attractive, being appealing, being a model for others in terms of culture, in terms of democratic values, in terms of ideology, in terms of even pop, in terms of pop culture and so on. The actors of soft power are quite diverse. NGOs, think tanks, companies, foundations, universities, churches are involved as well. And it was a term that was invented when the Cold War ended. But this term was picked up by Russia as well. And Russia invested a lot into soft power. And for example, the Ruski Mir Foundation, Valdai Club, Russian Orthodox Church has been all very important assets of Russian soft power. And Russia increased its soft power spending from about 2005. At the same time, let's take a look at its impact. You won't see in detail this graph, but on the left, you can see the favorability of Russia back to 2013. On the right, in 2022, so post-invasion. So before the Crimean annexations, for example, 42% of the Canadians thought about Russia in a favorable manner. More people than thought unfavorable. Right now, in Canada, it's only 20% 30% who thinks 10% who thinks favorable about Russia. So it declined a lot, and we can see it in France, we can see it in Germany, we can see it in all over the Western world, with a few exceptions, for example, Greece. But generally, the image of Russia have deteriorated a lot after the Crimean invasion, and then after right now the Crimean annexation, and right now the Russian invasion. So, can be regarded as a soft power success? Definitely not. And even in the former fan club of Russia, among the far-right parties and the supporters of far-right parties, Russia had become less popular. So we could observe it before the invasion that voters of parties like Lega Nord or Italy, or UKIP and the Brexit party in the UK, or let's say the Hungarian Jobbik party than Fidesz party. The thing is that Russia was more popular than in the voter base of far-right parties than in the overall population. But it had declined quite a lot. So even but Matteo Salvini, who previously wore a Putin T-shirt, tried to save his image after the invasion by trying to help Ukrainian refugees. He was mocked because of that by some Polish politicians, but I mean the general zeitgeist was that Russia's image is that Russia is a less reliable partner. The image of Russia have declined practically everywhere. At the same time, can we say that the image of Russia was totally makes it impossible to assert foreign policy influence? Definitely not. Back to 2018, the relative majority of the Western in the Western countries thought that Russia is more influential than it has been before. So for a longer time, we can see that Russia, back to 2018, Russia was already much less popular than in 2013, but it was seen as more influential. And this is definitely a sharp power success. So what is sharp power? I will start with quoting Marcel van Herpen, who has a brilliant book. It has a cheap title, Putin's Propaganda Machine, but it's a very deep and well-written book. And his main argument is that Russia, Vladimir Putin's Russia is using soft power for a longer time, but it was never really soft. Why? Because from the very beginning, it mostly implied state actors, and the soft power offensives of Russia were mainly state-supported or coming from state proxies. So the classical soft power that's the American universities represent were totally lacking from this picture. It thought in zero-sum games. So you can only be strong in the soft power world if you destroy the image of your competitor, of the United States, of the West, of the European Union, and so on, because it cannot be a win-win game. And there was from the very beginning a strong involvement of secret services, and also illegal actions were part of the soft power toolkit of the Russian Federation. So what Marcel van Herpen calls as Russian soft power, he argues that it's hard power in velvet gloves. So this is practically something similar that the inventors of the concept sharp power have came up with. Sharp power, this concept have born at the National Endowment for Democracy, and the researchers at the think tank of the National Endowment for Democracy. They say that the era of soft power is practically over for authoritarian forces. If you take at Russia, if you take at China, they don't even try to paint themselves as sympathetic anymore. They don't want to be attractive. They want to be feared. They don't want to be loved. They want to be feared. And sharp power is efforts to pierce, penetrate, or perforate the political and information environments in targeted countries. This authoritarian influence is not principally about attraction or persuasion. Instead, it centers on distraction and manipulation and confusion. So the nature is something different. So you have to be a very successful spoiler to have an impact on the foreign policy level, but the mindset is just different than in the classical soft power. What are the features of the Russian sharp power? Active measures, as I said, have been very important from the very beginning. Role of secret services, power vertical, disinformation, active measures. So the classical toolkit of the Russian secret services that have been a characteristic of the influence of the Soviet Union as well. So we definitely see a strong continuity here. And the mere fact is that the leader of the Russian Federation is an ex-KGB colonel, of course, make this continuity even more important and self-evident. Repulsion is at least as important as attraction. So you don't necessarily want to build up a very attractive image. Even if you took a look at Russia Today's coverage on Russia, most of the time you didn't have that kind of line that was very strong in the propaganda of the Soviet Union, that this is the best place in the world. It's a bit hard to sell, but the more important thing is that you destroy the image of your competitor. So citizens of United States, of Canada, of European Union, and so on should feel that they live in a corrupt place, they live in a nihilist place, they live in a place where they are not taken seriously, where democracy is just a facade, everyone is run from the back, everything is run from the background, and so on. So it's more important that you throw the mud on your competitor than that you stay attractive. Confusion is very important. So modern disinformation of Russia, which is part of the sharp power toolkit, is not necessarily about sending one message. It's about sending multiple messages to totally confuse the audience. For example, in the Russian disinformation sites during COVID, you could read two messages at the same time. One is that COVID is fake and it was just invented by Western secret services, the whole idea. The second one is that it's a deadly dangerous bioweapon that is invented by the United States. So how can something that doesn't exist be a very dangerous bioweapon at the same time? But this kind of, so the most important thing is not to send one message as it's, let's say, in a classical Soviet propaganda was, but to confuse the audience. I mean, there were about 12 official narratives about why the MH17 plane was shot down above eastern Ukraine. So it was American planes shooting it down, Ukrainian planes shooting it down. It exploded in the air and it was full of corpses originally, and a whole lot of variety of narratives coming from Russian official sources. And we shouldn't think that the short-term memory of Russian leaders is so bad. We should think that it's a tactical confusion. And the most important thing is that you're lost in the jungle of interpretations, and finally you can be persuaded about practically anything. Mimicking is crucially important. The twisted copy-paste of Western policies and solutions, I will explain it in a bit more details. Decentralized centralization, so the nature of Russian active measures, for example, is that the goals are made on the political level. An important example, for example, interference into the 2016 elections in the United States. We know it from Soldatov and other good investigative journalists in Russia that there was a decision in the Kremlin to interfere and on the side of Donald Trump, but then it's dedicated to mostly GRU, sometimes FSB and SVR colonels who have their own room for maneuvering on how to run the show. And also when it comes to Russian sharp power, other actors are involved as well, such as Konstantin Malofeyev, an Orthodox oligarch who put an awful lot of money in the Ukrainian invasion of Russia. Also, he was supporting far-right parties from its own money. So, and its variability of actors enables the Kremlin to plausibly deny that they were directly involved. Cyberattacks is a good example as well. And authoritarian inflation, I will explain also what is that. So some tools of Russian sharp power in contemporary Europe and Central Eastern Europe, supporting fringe parties, spreading disinformation, corrosive capital, investments with a with a highly corrupt nature that enables the Kremlin to buy influence into the target countries through buying up top-level businessmen and politicians at the same time, hackings, authoritarian inflation. I will jump it over. There has been 4 waves of soft or sharp power offensive from Russia, where the Russian Federation increased the budget that it invests into these exercises. In 2003, the color revolution in Georgia, and in 2004 in Ukraine, what the lesson that Russian Federation have learned is that despite the fact that they would have loved that majority of the world population accepts their version that it was a legitimate peacekeeping mission, or call it whatever you want, or a reaction to a provocation. In most parts of the Western world, it was seen as a brutal invasion and creating a frozen conflict. So that's after the, I confused it with the Georgian conflict. Okay, so the color revolutions first, and the Ukrainian, in Georgia and Ukraine. So the lesson that was learned then, that the perception was that the West is investing a lot in soft power. So we have to as well, in order to remain influential. And Ruski Mir was founded in 2007. Russia Today was founded in 2005. So the goal of these institutions was to counterbalance the Western soft power, and in that respect, it was always a kind of reaction to the West's attempts. In 2008, as I said, the Georgian conflict, then it was Russia could see that the West does not buy its narrative. In 2014, the Ukrainian crisis and the annexation of Crimea, it was when I think Russia have suffered the first really big, let's say, loss in its information warfare, in the sense that it was really difficult again to sell it in the world as a just intervention, and the invasion of Ukraine. So mostly these soft power, sharp power investments came after Russia could experience that either its influence was on the decline, like in the cases of the color revolutions, where they saw that countries are deciding to leave the sphere of influence of Russia deliberately, and this is something that they wanted to counterbalance, or they felt that they cannot sell their stories internationally. What is, and this is, as I said, usually these investments into soft or sharp power are reactionary, in the sense that the perception from the Kremlin is that the West invests a lot into soft power. It can transform it into hard power as well, that they spend a lot on disinformation, that they spend a lot of cyber attacks and so on. So if we want to keep up with the West, then we have to invest as well. Vladimir Putin, back to 2014, made a speech in which he says they make active use of the information system, they is the West, as an instrument of so-called soft power to achieve their goals. And if you take a look at the military strategy of Russia, the national security strategy, and some articles of military leaders of Russia, usually you have this situation assessment that the West is better in information warfare, in soft power, in hybrid warfare than us. So we have to keep up. So again, this twisted copy-paste. So we have a mimicking strategy here. And this mimicking articulates it visually as well in taking over some of the symbols of the West. Let's take a look at the flag of Novorossiya, for example. Novorossiya is the newly annexed, let's say, Russia extended with the newly annexed parts of Ukraine. Its borders are a bit, how to say, vague, and it's in motion, but still, does it remind us to something? Probably for good reasons. The Confederate flag. hard to imagine that the ones who came up with the idea of let's create the flag of Novorossiya did not inspired from this flag. And of course, it can be partially just copy paste, partially it can be a bit of trolling, but also at the same time, part of the game here is to use the symbols that are familiar to the West, so that you can just more easily persuade them. It feels familiar. It feels a bit more sympathetic. Or let's take a look at the Collective Security Treaty Organization that was established back to 1992. Member states of this defense cooperation are Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, Tajikistan. The treaty has a fourth point quite similar to Article 5, which is about collective defense. If one member state of this defense cooperation is attacked, then it's an attack against all. But for some reasons, the logo seems to be a bit similar to the emblem of NATO. And also another more recent example, on below we can see Vladimir Putin is cheering the so-called annexation of the new regions or Zaporozhye, Luhansk, Donetsk, and Kherson together in big fun. And it might remind us to another scene that happened a few weeks ago where when Zelensky was making fives with Western leaders who were visiting Ukraine. So as part of the West, practically right now, Ukraine is mimicked and imitated in a similar manner than the West. So, but there are other examples for mimicking that probably reveals that it can be more sufficient. Russia Today, for example. Russia Today was set up in a way to make it as entertaining as, let's say, the boulevard or the tabloid channels in the Anglo-Saxon world. And part of its popularity is that it could well combine tabloid content, non-political content, with conspiracy theories and with direct propaganda, but in a rather entertaining manner. Most of the, Russia Today employs local guests, for example, and employs local colleagues from UK, from France, from Germany, and so on, to make it more familiar to the domestic audience, and it had a big impact at the time. Right now, it's banned in the European Union, so it won't have too much anymore. Valdai Club. Valdai Club is a copy-paste of the World Economic Forum. It was a big annual gathering, or has been an annual gathering, where Vladimir Putin could meet with leading Western intellectuals in a format that is, again, familiar with them. So this mimicking, imitation can be a good outreach strategy as well. And many, I talked to a few people who have met with Vladimir Putin in Valdai clubs, and if you meet the man, your attitude will change. It's like you will see the things in a more nuanced way. So this kind of tactics work. Electoral observation missions, copy-pasting the Western electoral observation missions of OSCE, of EU and others. Russia had created its own fake electoral observation missions, mostly filled up with extreme left and extreme right politicians, neo-Nazis, neo-communists, people who just came out from the prison to legitimize the elections for the domestic of Russia, of Kazakhstan, of, let's say, the referendums in the annexed territories of Ukraine and so on, to legitimize it for the Russian domestic audience and for the international audience as well. Again, something that seems similar, but the function is a bit different. While the electoral observation missions evaluate the process of the elections, here the function is to legitimize the outcome. I told it already, that imitation mirroring can be at least as tactical as just just a mirroring strategy. So, bit about conspiracy theories. So the first sharp power tool, as I said, or feature was mimicking that I was talking about. Second would be conspiracy theories. So conspiracy theories proved to be probably the most successful, as said, in Russian sharp power. Why? Conspiracy theories sell. They sell movies, they sell populist politicians, and they can sell foreign policy as well. Pretty well. Conspiracy theories are entertaining. Conspiracy theories can be quite revelative. They have a value. They can express the suspicion that exists in the Western societies against the leaders, and so on. Russia today was using conspiracy theories hard time even at the 2016, before the 2016 U.S. elections. There was a piece of there was an evening show where Hillary Clinton was shown as a member of the Illuminati, and it was a quite hardcore anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that he was involved in, and it was a Russia Today prime time before the 2016 elections. Of course, we shouldn't think that many Americans changed their minds because of that very piece, but it was part of this. It was well connected to the let's say disinformation ecosystem that was built up about Donald Trump's campaign team. At the same time, it was a time when Pizzagate theory was also quite popular, that the Hillary Clinton's campaign team was involved into pedophiling and even child trafficking and so on. So conspiracy theories can work particularly well if they resonate to the theories of the domestic audience. And they have an intellectual appeal as well. So what is the slogan of Russia Today? Question more. Quite intellectual, right? I mean, don't be fooled. Don't go with the sheeps. Question more. Think. Things are not necessarily as they seem to be. Telling the untold. Probably the untold is untold because it doesn't exist, but still, let's tell it. Truth is in between, right? So don't think in black and white. Things are more nuanced. So, and that's why I think some parts of the let's say of this whataboutism, of the relativization that comes through, for example, about the Ukrainian of Russian invasion in Ukraine, the Western world, is that they can they can well resonate to these intellectual habits of see things from different perspectives, which is of course generally a important feature, but they can use it to exploit the very deep suspicion that exists in most Western societies about the mainstream press, about the institutions of representative democracy, and so on. But conspiracy theories can be deadly dangerous weapons as well. And I would quote here Ilya Yablokov, who wrote a brilliant book on the conspiracy theories in Russia. He also wrote a piece in the New York Times. It was in April this year, 5 conspiracy theories that Putin has weaponized. But he wrote a book as well. And his main argument is that Putin's regime was using conspiracy theories as an important PR tool, a political marketing tool, domestically and internationally as well, with a kind of intellectual distance. And as he argues, Putin has fallen into the trap of his own conspiracy theories, and he started to believe them. And there are some conspiracy theories that became really mainstream. For example, the West wants to carve up Russia's territory. This is a conspiracy theory that some Russian pundits told that he once met with Madeleine Albright, and with mind reading, he could read her mind that she wants to take Russian territories because they are very rich in natural resources, and as they took over Iraq when they needed the Americans, they wanted to took over Russia as well. And this information really comes from mind reading, from someone who allegedly met with Madeleine Albright. In later interviews, the same gentleman admitted that he never met with Madeleine Albright. Still, probably mind reading works from the distance as well. But conspiracy theories to this absurdity came up in a speech of Vladimir Putin, for example, that as an argument of why we have to save Russia because the West not just wants Ukraine and not just surrounding us with NATO, but wants our territory as well. Or the global LGBTQ movement is a plot against Russia. That gay people are gay to destroy Russia's grandiosity. So they are all part of this grand plot, or they might be just soldiers, but the inventors of the story think this way. Or Ukraine is preparing bioweapons to use against Russia. So these were all conspiracy theories that were pretty marginal, let's say 10 years ago. And Vladimir Putin was a guy who delegated conspiracy theorizing to figures like Dmitry Kiselyov or to Zhirinovsky and others. But right now he became the conspiracy theorist in chief. And it, of course, we can't, unlike we can't read their minds. But it seems to be that they take their conspiracy theories pretty seriously. And conspiracy theories sell really well in Central Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. Just an example, it's a non-political one, but it was a very prominent conspiracy theory that came up in pro-Russian propaganda outlets. Viruses have been produced in government laboratories to control our freedom. 43% of Hungarians believe so. 53% of Romanians. Let's take a look at Western Europe, where it's practically totally marginal. So in Southern and Eastern part of the European Union, these theories definitely sell well. They sell well in the West as well, but not that well. The cure for cancer exists, but it's hidden from the public by commercial interest. Big business wants to kill you just because and put the cure in secret because it's in their interest. 48% of Hungarians believe this theory. And again, it's very strong in Cyprus, Greece, Bulgaria, for example, countries that are traditionally more sympathetic to Russia. So it seems that conspiracy theorizing and pro-Russian sympathies pretty much comes hand in hand in the European Union. Probably the exception is Poland. And we can see that conspiracy theories have become really, really influential in some countries. Pro-Russian conspiracy theories that were spread by the Kremlin. This is coming from a Hungarian poll from this June, where we found that, for example, 46% of Hungarians agree that lives of Hungarians in Transcarpathia are constantly being threatened by Ukrainian nationalists, or 28% believes in the theory that United States is operating secret laboratories in Ukraine where biological weapons are being developed. Of course, biological weapons that can selectively only target Russians, no one else, as the theory goes. But it is, I think it is a pretty high figure. And of course, it was not the case if it were only marginal Russian trolls and information sources financed by Russia were spreading that. Of course, conspiracy theories can be very appealing and attractive and widespread in countries where when the mainstream picks them up. So if you have at least one important party on government or in the mainstream, like governmental party in Hungary, that amplify these theories, of course, they will have a higher audience. Yeah, I would tell a bit about the third element of sharp power influence that I mentioned, the so-called authoritarian inflation. So by authoritarian inflation, I mean the phenomenon where authoritarian superpowers buy certain tools, sharp power tools, can look stronger, bigger, more powerful than in reality. And this is something that you have almost also among animals. So certain kinds of fishes, or if someone has a cat, they can tell as well. I mean, they sometimes puff themselves up to look bigger, stronger. So it's a deception tool that is strong in our evolutionary heritage as well. And of course, it exists in our everyday personal life. It exists in our everyday foreign policy, and democratic states do the same, of course. Everyone wants to sell itself as more powerful. My argument would be that usually authoritarian superpowers such as Russia, such as China, are much more successful in that than Western superpowers. Tools of authoritarian inflation, disinformation campaigns, corrosive capital investments, political influence operations, and let's see a few examples from the public opinion that how it works in reality. So we had a poll in Hungary back to 2018 where we found that more than half of the Hungarians thought that Russia is among the first 6 export partners of Hungary. And more than 80% thought that it's among the first 12. And if we measure the, let's say, intensity of trade relations in export, in reality, Russia was the 70th biggest export partner of Hungary. Back to then, still, I mean, more than half of the Hungarian population thought that it's among the first 6. So Russia was perceived way more powerful in its economic power than in reality. Another example of authoritarian inflation. When you ask people in Central Eastern Europe, or broader in Eastern Europe, that which military is more powerful, of Russia's red line or of the United States, blue line. In many countries, the army of Russia, that as we could see, the annual expenditure on military is about the 1/12 or in Russia, or was 1/12 of Russia before the invasion than the US is. So in Serbia, in North Macedonia, in Montenegro, in Bulgaria, in Slovakia, in the Czech Republic, so many NATO countries as well, people feel that Russia has a more powerful army. And why is it dangerous? Then the question can arise, okay, why we are teaming up with NATO? You know, we are probably in the wrong camp. If the other side is stronger, why not? Why do this Cold War warmongering, right? Why not to stay neutral, or why not to be in good terms with Russia as well? And yeah, of course, no question that some of these countries have experienced the strength of the Soviet military at the time. So history, of course, matters in that respect. But still, I mean, this perception that the Russian army is bigger, stronger than of the US, it was in 2021. I think it's quite scary among many NATO member states as well. So, and another example of the fact that it's not just Russia that can do well the authoritarian inflation game, but China as well. According to a public opinion poll that was published in RFERL, this is the ratio of the Serbians who think that, for example, 40% of the Serbians think that China gave the most aid to the country in the last few years. 15% thinks it's Russia. Only 18% thinks it's the EU. And let's take a look at the reality. The EU was giving about 3/4 of all the aid that was going to Serbia. Again, huge gap between the perception and reality. And that's huge gap between the perception and reality that we can observe many, many times. I think it just underlines how important to talk about the social psychological factors. Then we talk about foreign policy and not only the fundamentals of economic strength, of military strength, of, let's say, energy influence. Okay, there are many effects of authoritarian inflation. I think probably the most important one, why it's dangerous, it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if you think that someone else is extremely powerful, that if you think that without Russian energy, Europe would not survive, then you will just invest more into additional pipelines and so on, as it happened in Europe in the last few years. But we can right now see that, okay, taking off Russian gas, I would not say it's not painful, but it's probably will be less painful for Europe than many things. And of course, the stronger Russia and China looks and seems like in their international image, the louder the voices will be that, okay, the West is on the decline and it's just a sinking ship that we have to abandon. And I think the very same ideas that circulated about 100 years ago by Oswald Spengler and others about the decline of the West and how the Western liberal democratic model is on the decline. I mean, if you read excerpt from this book, it could be the copy-paste of current, populist speeches that are that are pushing for the same argument that, our regime our system and our values are just does not make us strong enough to survive. And if we take a look back to it was written between the two world wars. And the 20th century, I think, proved Oswald Spengler pretty wrong. And let's be hopeful that probably right now this declinist apocalyptic visions on the collapse of the West will prove similarly wrong. But of course, and this is a part of the science. If you take a look at the public opinion polls, many see not just that Russia and China is on the rise, but also that the US is on the decline, that the Europe is on the decline. So it's part of the era that we live in and the public sentiment. But of course, if Western journalists are painting, for example, Vladimir Putin as the most powerful man in the world, as it happened in 2016 in one of the shows of Farid Zakaria, who otherwise I greatly admire, but I think it was probably not the best title that you can give to a show. I think the spin doctors in the Kremlin have just opened the champagne that, okay, we just don't have any work to do in the West. If this is the image of Putin in CNN on prime time, then why to work more on making Putin seem more powerful? And I would slowly move towards the conclusions and some recommendations. So in general, when we generally think about international relations and especially in a times when we are living, not we, but parts of the world are in a brutal war, size does matter. Of course, that's what we are thinking about. That the most important thing when it comes to foreign policy is the size of economies, the size of military, size of nukes, and size of natural resources. So size does matter, and no question it does. And the realist, neo-realist approach in international relations, this is what it's emphasized. But other things matter as well. What we see is that perceptions and images do matter, and they can sometimes matter more than reality. And we could see it in the polls on authoritarian inflation. Ideology and history does matter. If someone listened to or read the speech of Vladimir Putin on 30 September, he delivered to the selected group of people on the occasion of the annexation. It was full of historical references. It was full of ideological statements, and it seems like public opinion does matter, and psychology does matter as well. So we tend to think about state leaders sometimes as highly rational actors. And let's think about what was the perception of Vladimir Putin in the West about 10 years ago. He is a KGB colonel, no emotions, total rationality, chess player, can calculate all the steps and their consequences. That it seems like he got entrapped by unique version of let's say, of interpretation of history, also by some kinds of ideology, let's say Eurasianist, Eurasianist, imperialist ideologies, and also that the conspiracy theories that the Russian regime have let's say, fabricated and disseminated prime time, it had an impact on the disseminators as well. Why we can say that Russian sharp power still matters? From one perspective, it seems like probably Putin's regime is at the beginning of the end, in the sense that these mass mobilizations and so on, I mean, they just, and all the military losses in Eastern Ukraine could suggest that, yeah, the authoritarian deflation have already started. So that the fact that Russia, I mean, Putin believed that Russia is so powerful, then it projected to the world, but it proved to be wrong. Does it mean that all of the topic that we are talking about is less relevant because Russia's ability to impose some impact on the Western decline? I don't think so. First of all, yeah, this is what I thought, that the sharp power techniques has an impact on the source as well, on the disseminator. So it seems that they had an impact on the Russian leadership, and it changed their perception of the world that led to their policy decisions, such as the invasion. Putin's regime is not over yet, and winter is coming, which is pretty important, and especially in Europe. The increased very high inflation and increasing gas and electricity prices, of course, will broaden the audience for the messages that we have to stay out of the conflict, do not support Ukraine anymore, especially not with weapons, but not even with aids, because we need the money. We are starving, we are freezing, and so on. And I mean, the victory of the mostly, I mean, dominantly, and I think that Giorgia Meloni's pro-Ukrainian image is a bit deceiving in that respect. I think it's a dominantly pro-Russian government that has been elected in Italy. Probably it will be not the only one. And this pro-Russian radical right, radical left forces in the European Union that seem to be, let's say, shifting more in a pro-Ukrainian direction. The beginning, right now, are amplifying their message that we need peace. The West has to stop supporting Ukraine, and let's sit to the negotiation table and give territories to Russia so that we can enforce. So, and as the sanctions, and there are many voices that blame the sanctions in Europe, and I think that it will be just a more powerful message, and it will increase the audience for sharp power. There is a unanimity in the EU and NATO decision making, and one weakest link is enough. For example, right now, Hungary has not, let's say, ratified yet the accession request of or accession document of EU of Finland and Sweden to the NATO. Probably they will. Most probably they will, and I'm hopeful that they will. Also, Hungary has supported, let's say, 8 rounds of sanctions so far in the European Union. Still, the idea lingers that some of them should be blocked, and you need one member state, only one member state in these organizations to block decisions. So sharp power, if it can target the weakest thing, it can be highly efficient. There is some continuity as well. But let me remind you that, for example, the Protocols of Elders of Zion, the forgery of let's say, the Bible of anti-Semites that made a huge career in 20th century, including the Third Reich, it was forged, it was created by Okhrana, by the Tsarist secret services. So these kind of tactics that I'm talking about, these not just have historical roots in the KGB and the Soviet Union, but even from before. So we can also think about that when Putin will be over, some of these tactics will pretty much prevail to have an impact on the West. Ultra-conservative values have a broader audience, and mimicking conspiracy theories, authoritarian inflation are used by China as well, and not just Russia. And final thought on how to move towards authoritarian deflation. So I think the biggest problem we can have, and probably it's a problem with towards Russia and China as well is that we tend to overestimate their power, and it's a defeatist strategy to a certain extent. And we have to keep the reality check on how powerful they really are. One thing, the other thing is that understanding more the perception of the West is crucially important. So this mimicking and twisted copy-paste strategy leads to the fact that most of the policy decisions in Vladimir Putin's Russia could have been projected if we paid more attention on how the West steps of the West are perceived, because this is again a mirroring. And really last thought. So there was in the Putin's annexation speech on 30 September, he quoted Ivan Ilyin and his words. If I consider Russia my motherland, that means that I love as a Russian, contemplate as things, sing and speak as Russian, that I believe in the spiritual strength of the Russian people, and so on. So Ivan Ilyin is an ideologue who had an impact on Putin's approach for a long time, and skeptics downplayed its importance. He was openly sympathetic for fascism for a long time. He was practically a fascist author who never thought that Ukraine is an existing entity that should exist, that always thought in totalitarian terms. And it seems that ideology did have an impact, and these readings had an impact on Putin's decisions. So my final thought will be a quote from a friend of mine, Eugene Finko, a brilliant historian at the Johns Hopkins University. But given that there are other historians in the room as well, probably this message will resonate well. He tweeted it right after the Vladimir Putin's speech on the annexation, that does anyone still need any additional arguments for serious investments in history, area studies, social sciences, and HIMARS. So, and I think he just makes the point. So for good, efficient defensive strategies, besides spending on the military, we just have to spend more on understanding the things. And this is, I think, great intellectual hubs, such as Monk Ceres, plays a very important role in. So thanks a lot for your attention. Sorry if I was longer than you expected, but any questions and comments in there?
Thanks a lot, Peter. Thank you. A lot there. You know what we do now? We have question and answer period. Right away. Please introduce yourself, if you don't mind.
My name is Eric Brazo, and often in many, whether it's articles or as we were just mentioning earlier, we talk about the right wing or the far right. And often you rarely hear the far left in terms of the media. Right? What designates someone as far right as opposed to in the middle? For example, cold is only cold compared to where you put zero is. What's the starting level, the bar? You understand my question?
I'm not entirely sure.
Okay, what's the difference between who decides on the definition of the term hard right or far right as opposed to the middle? Who decides where that measuring yard starts, the measuring line?
I think so. When I use the term far right or populist right, I mainly think about parties and political players who paint themselves. Let's say who. I mean, Kasmuda has a definition that its characteristics. I mean, three features characterize these parties: nativism, populism, and authoritarianism. And I think it's pretty much true for the political players I mentioned. But I did not want to go into very long how to say definite. I think I made enough definitional remarks anyway. But have you felt that any of the players I mentioned fall out of this category?
Well, you were talking about at some point we talked about misinformation.
Yeah.
And you showed that Putin was on the cover or on the CNN article. And several years ago, many years ago, I believe Hitler was on the cover of Time magazine in the 1930s, the late 20s, actually.
So was Mussolini.
Exactly, right.
But not as model figures, but as important figures, the most important man in the world. And I think they were pretty right about Adolf Hitler, to be frank.
Well, he was an important figure, right?
Yeah.
But I think you were alluding to the CNN article as misinformation in terms of their saying Putin has all of this power.
I would not say it's misinformation. Misinformation, not disinformation,
Not disinformation.
but misinformation. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
Absolutely.
well, so we could say CNN is a gatekeeper to information in terms
Sure,
of
we can.
popular information, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, then. So again, when someone is labeled like Donald Trump would be labeled far right, at some point he was.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Would you agree that that could be misinformation?
No, because I believe in that. But it's an opinion that can be challenged. Feel free to challenge it. Feel free to think otherwise. On the other hand, let me remind you that I talked about far right and far left parties as well in the European landscape.
You did, I'm saying in general, the media usually does not. They talk about far right, but very rarely do they talk about far left.
Yeah, I mean, the reason, so analytically, I would say that the far right in Europe has been just being more successful in the last period. And it's like, you can think about the reasons, but it's like, Die Linke was rather successful at the time. Syriza was successful at the time, but overall in the European Parliament, for example, the representation of the far right parties is way higher than the far left parties. And we made a study in which we analyzed who are the most pro-Russian voices in the European Parliament. And in the top 10, we had more far left guys than far right guys. Their overall representation. For example, people from the Sinn Féin party in Ireland. On the other hand, their overall impact on European politics is right now lower. So it seems like the far right or populist right, again, I'm open to other definitional approaches as well, is just way more powerful in Europe these days. And probably I think in the Anglo-Saxon world as well, but it's out of the scope of my talk. Thanks for your remark.
I'm going to go Professor Kalmar, just back there.
Yeah.
Ivan, nice to see you.
Ivan Kalmar, so it's somewhat connected to what we were talking about. Sorry, I wasn't here at the very beginning of this excellent talk. Thank you very much. I am not aware that Russia is particularly fostering far left narratives, but far right narratives are surely much more important, both quantitatively and qualitatively, as you showed us the quote of quoting Ivan Illich. And so I was struck by the images that you showed us about mimicking the West. And among them was a pretty well a copy of the Confederate flag for Novorossiya, which I think is even much more similar to its original than the one about NATO. I think the Confederate flag is quite convincing. And it may be sharp power. I think it is. I think you made a convincing case in the sense of just stirring up trouble, this imitation. But I think it is soft power for the far right. It's not ideology free, nor is a lot of Russian propaganda. It takes a very clear position on the side of a certain kind of, we might call it far right, and I think that flag probably was not meant only to appeal to the West, but also to a streak in Russia, like the Zhirinovsky motorcycle gang, that admires kind of American white supremacist, fascist tendencies.
Yeah, thanks for the remark. there is a, I mean, there are two approaches in talking about how to say Russian persuasion or operations, or let's say information operations. One says that it's ideological, and it's also connected to your question a bit. It's ideologically neutral, and I think it's true to the sense that if you that usually the tactic is about amplifying system critical voices, and I'm not saying anything about their relevance or how and also let me be clear here. When I talk about far left and far right, it's not a, it might sound as a highly, how to say, evaluative, normative description. I think that it's more up to their, let's look up anti-systemic, right? Anti-systemic left, anti-systemic right. So there are voices that are amplified from the anti-systemic left as well. For example, if you take a look at the speech of Putin, again, he talked a lot about the colonization, and this
but
is.
so does the far right.
Yes, you're right, but probably it's a term that is more fashionable on that anti-establishment left. I think you're right. The other school of thought, the neutrality argument says that, for example, let's take a look at what Russia did at the 2016 US election. It amplified the voices of white supremacists and of black nationalists at the same time, to fuel conflicts. In Bulgaria and in some other countries, there are some proof that anti-establishment left and right-wing forces also had some, probably money as well, from Russia, again, to make some clash, to make conflict, to deepen the polarization. And if you want to deepen the polarization, you just cannot listen to your heart, right? And go for, and this would be the other school of thought, and I think both has something truth in it. And the other school of thought says that as the Russian regime itself is becoming increasingly traditional, ultra-conservative, I would not just nationalist, imperialist, and very strongly, let's say, anti-modernist. So you have the strongly right-wing mindset there. This is more of their ideological export than their support for the radical left or anti-establishment. So I think you're right that there is a bigger emphasis on the anti-establishment right, but there are some support for the left as well. And for example, few examples: D-Link politicians went to the electoral observation missions to Luhansk and Donetsk, for example, where there were the so-called referenda. So did some guys from Syriza, from the Czech Communist Party, from Sinn Féin, from the top of my head, but there were some others probably. They are not really mainstream forces, really. Thank you.
Monty, then Blythe, and then Miss Jones.
To begin with, my compliments to a most elegant tapestry of ideas, but running through my mind at all times is this, what I call prefix, sharp power. Power is power is power. And further definitions, I believe, disocclude the essence of what you're saying, notwithstanding that the values that you are attributing are well taken, and I respect them all. But either power is kinetic or non-kinetic, and everything else is subject for discussion. It's almost going to the infinity coming together. In a sense, you just keep going, but you never quite answer that. But to me, I'm glad your last quote anticipated what I was going to pose as my question. The value, the imperative, felt imperative of a critical liberal education, thinking truth to power, speaking truth to power, not being afraid to discomfort, so long as done with a Mian ethos, polite, respectful, deferential, willing to take criticism. Because what is upsetting me the most or frustrating me the most is what I call the denudation of values that in terms of people need to be cosseted. And one exemplar is that professor at NYU, or adjunct, I should say, at the Times clarified that in terms of organic chemistry, for those students trying to go into medical school because they found his program to be too tough. And NYU is considered to be an elite private university. And in a sense, why should they be subjected to harsh courses that would take away from them gaining entrance to medical school? So just going back to that, my big point being, in a sense, is being precise in terms of our language and words. And it takes nothing away from what you said. And I respect what you're saying, most excellent. But power to me is power. And it's either this or it's not that. And everything else is subject to attribution and subject to opinion. And for that, I thank you, sir.
Thank you. And I mean, no problem if we I mean, we can agree that we disagree on that point. I think, honestly, I feel a bit of a contradiction here because yeah, you can argue that power is power, period, but then you downplay a bit the social sciences that give more nuanced approach to influence. And I think the idea of soft power that I think also, I mean, it's also a highly challenged term for some right reasons as well. And honestly, I know that these definitions are used and the concepts themselves are a bit wild, but it will sound horrible. And I have to tell I'm a positivist, so I'm for harsh, I mean, I'm for sharp definitions. But when you talk about some vague phenomenon, I think the nature of, let's say, of this new forms of influence that are talking about is a bit vague, is multi-layered, it's more difficult to grasp conceptually than a certain level of, how to say, of conceptual freedom, I think, is needed. So I think that the term soft power still have some relevance, the term sharp power have even more relevance, but I mean, I totally respect your opinion as well. You can freely disagree with that. I mean, of course, you can argue that when it comes to real situations on the ground, like what's happening right now in Eastern Ukraine, yeah, finally, hard power says the final word, and hope, yeah, and hope for the best there. But if it's, I mean, if we are not in a war situation, and I think hard power, yeah, hard power decides most of the things. Of course, you have information operations at the same time and so on, but when you have a more peaceful time, then I think these concepts of soft power, sharp power have probably more relevance than during wartime.
And cultural power is
Hold
important.
on a
as well.
second, Monty. You're
Yeah,
asking-
I agree, but it's part of soft power.
That's one of my
as well.
students over there, Peter. I gotta give him priority here.
Yes.
Okay.
So thank you for your presentation, it was great. I liked your discussion of sharp power and the sorts of things that Russia is willing to do. Got me thinking about recent events. I'm sure you've heard about the destruction of the Nordstrom 2 pipeline.
Yes.
And so that's sort of connected to what you were saying. And that, so I'm an American. I'm on American Twitter. When I woke up that morning and saw the news, one of the things that I was sort of baffled by is how many Americans were immediately willing to blame our own government for blowing up Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is obviously what Russia is saying in sort of uncertain terms. They recently called for the Security Council meeting on it. And so that sort of connected my mind to the point about, you know, sort of weakening the willingness and the unanimity of the West. So I guess my question would be, does this strike you as something that Russia would do as like as a sharp power move, or is this somebody else at work? Obviously, events are forthcoming and we're not sure who did it yet, but does this strike you as something that is within that flavor?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, you know, if I knew the exact answer of how this attack happened and who was there, probably I was not sitting in this room, but in, you know, in some dark rooms somewhere in some state institutions. So I can tell that I do not dare to attribute. Yeah, more circumstantial evidence points towards Russia, but I would not jump to the conclusion necessarily. But yeah, as the argument goes, so this is what you mentioned. It's pretty much, I mean, part of this conspiracy mindset. First of all, it can exploit that many people in the Western world hate their own governments for good or bad terms. I mean, you know, citizens have the right to hate their governments, and this is what democracy is about. And good for us that we have this right. But of course, On the other hand, if you combine it with this logic that qui prodest, so whose interest was that? Then you can say that any country who sells energy has the interest of pushing up the energy prices, and then then it could be in the interest of the United States as well. So, but yeah, I honestly don't really believe that we had a good debate at one of the classes about that, how much the sharp power toolkit is something that only characterizes Russia and China these days and authoritarian powers, how much it characterizes the Western governments as well. And our argument was that, yeah, there were, I think, nasty periods in the let's say, foreign policy operations of the West as well. Think about the Cold War. For example, I don't think that we have this, that Western states whose, let's say, operation is much more under democratic control and much more accounted than of authoritarian states are just using the same toolkit. So it's, I correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know about the same kind of, let's say, political assassinations happening these days by Western governments than what is an everyday toolkit of Russian power. So I just don't think that any Western government would have done it. I mean, and yeah, we have examples when things like that turned out, but I think no government leaders would really, how to say, risk that. I think, honestly, the new, this piece of information that today appeared at New York Times, that Ukraine state actors were also involved in the assassination of the daughter of Alexander Dugin. I don't think it sells really well in the American public, but correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, it's like this kind of information can be something that can really undermine the reputation of Western governments. So hope it was a response to your question.
Yes, sir.
John Haley's my name, just a member of the community, very glad to be here, glad the doors are open to the truth. I enjoyed your talk, Peter, and I really enjoyed that long list that you had of various conspiracy theories, because there a lot of them I hear, and the other one I heard was a lot about corruption. It might be on the list, but corruption here. I would even meet Ukrainians who would talk about the biolabs, and they might say, I can justify the Russians coming into the Ukraine to deal with the biolabs, but he's overrun his state. So that's kind of effect on Ukrainians, 1 million in Canada. That's a couple of Ukrainians, that's not a lot. And other ones varying on that. But it's, the other element is, they seem not to, maybe in some cases you find they're pulling it out of nowhere. And as you say, sometimes just simply causing confusion, bringing opposite views. But the other thing I think, and this is where I have more problem with, some of them seem to have some degree of credibility. That no government's perfect, that no government has no corruption, that there might not be Nazis in it. And one of the things I'm troubled by is the response of people trying to deny so-called conspiracy theories, is their overreaction and denial of all this. And I find this deeply, deeply unhelpful. And I think when people need, not just this issue, on COVID-19 is another big issue, it needs to be nuanced, which is a word you've used on, to talk about, there might be elements of that, but it doesn't mean the whole government's Nazi or the whole government is corrupting and it's doing this. It needs to have some degree about truth. It's about acknowledging some degree of culpability. Otherwise, when you begin to see it, it becomes very difficult. Well, geez, the Russians are saying that, or whoever's saying that. I think it becomes an integrity issue, and it means you're actually working against yourself on your own propaganda, if I may be a little playful on the terminologies. It needs to be a nuanced acknowledgement, because I don't think the Russians or the Chinese or billions of other people are necessarily telling absolute lies absolutely all the time. So it needs a bit of acknowledgement of some acknowledgement of elements of truth.
I think it's a brilliant point and very important. I think that mostly the disinformation can be efficient disinformation campaigns where, I mean, they resonate to the audience, and there are, of course, disinformation campaigns and conspiracy theories that have zero connection to reality. Let's think about Protocols of Elders of Zion. I mean, it's like, was there a particle of truth? No, nothing. But in other cases there might be, and the difficulty when debunking conspiracy theories and disinformation is that you have two strategies, possible strategies to follow. One is to follow the same black and white logic. No 100% lie, nothing is true. I mean, our governments are all perfect. There has never been nationalists in Ukraine and things like that. No, but it will, might sound persuasive, it's easier to sell message, but I think both morally and intellectually, there is only another way to do. And we hosted Michael Weiss to some talks to Budapest earlier this year. The journalist, investigative journalist, who even was at CNN and Daily Beast and a whole lot of assets, quite popular. And I think I really like his argument. He always started that, I mean, there were questions like, but Ukrainians are doing disinformation as well, right? And he saw that, yes, they are doing some. For example, they want to show their military success is bigger than in reality. And there were some cases, for example, I don't know if you've heard about that an old lady hit down a drone with a glass of cucumber, and she became a hero. I mean, there are not so many proof supporting that it ever happened, but it's a nice story. It gives some morale for the Ukrainians. And his argument was that, of course, in information warfare, you have it on both sides, but it's not even comparable to the lies that, the whole Ukraine is a Nazi country. Therefore, if you want to denazify it, you have to do something with the population as well. So it's like the thing is that you have small portion of this at one, and you have a huge portion in the other side, and the content is different. It does not mean that you have to put an equal mark between the two. So I think you're absolutely right that in the pushback and counter argument, the same black and white logic just cannot be followed. And also, I mean, he told as well that there was, I mean, American diplomacy also, at the time invested quite a lot in information operations in the global south, but in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. And but for example, let's think about compare right now RFERL to Russia today. And there is some difference between the two, how seriously they think about journalistic integrity.
Thank you.
I'm going to take two more questions. Peter, so I have this woman at the back there, and then this gentleman right here. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Aziza. Just a point of information on the question of assassinations. The former UN Special Rapporteur Philip Alston, who I believe was the Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial killings, had actually criticized the US in the context of the war on terror for setting precedents on targeted political assassinations that could easily be globalized and picked up by other countries. Some of the historians like Greg Brandon have traced the very long history of US misinformation campaigns with respect to Latin America, for instance. And so it seems like if we're wondering whether sharp power also characterizes the imperial operations of the US, I think that it's clear that those similar tactics are used, but just perhaps in places that don't attract the same kind of attention in current colonial geographies.
Thank you for raising the point, and let me connect it with the previous question. I think it's important not to say that the Western world is totally free of those. What I can tell is that in the areas where I have some expertise, I think the two is not even comparable. There is, for example, soft power investments by the United States. Yes, I know. There are journalists who have better information with US diplomats and sometimes write the stories in a particular way that the US government would like to see that. But I think but when it comes to, let's say, spreading deadly dangerous conspiracy theories like anti-vaccination, we just don't have it from Western governments. So you might be, I think this argument is right that the more it's under attention by the Western world, the less you can have it from the West. So, and with extrajudicial killings, again, I'm not an expert and I don't have a very clear-cut opinion on that, but I think you're partially right. Yeah, I think the extrajudicial killings that I know about, I think it's probably easier to justify, let's say, in the case of terrorists than in the case of, let's say, human rights activists or journalists that are often are in the target of authoritarian countries. But yeah, I think your point is good and valid. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I just actually wanted to add one point. The main difference is that when the US kills or has an extrajudicial killing, they pretty much say, yes, we did it. While the others say, oh, we don't know who did it.
Actually, they don't even release statistics or numbers on how many people that they killed. I mean,
They
it's been
do
very
some,
hard
we
for
only know about
journalists
the
to find
celebrities.
information on it, so they don't
Yeah.
say that.
When they killed Al Qaeda, they said.
Yeah, when they kill some people, there's
Yeah.
television. I mean, for example, the Bureau of
But we don't
Investigative
know who they, we don't
Journalism.
know who they killed that they didn't say that they killed, right?
Well, that's why you have groups like the
But
Bureau of
I still gonna let this gentleman's got a question.
Sorry, that was just a comment.
Yeah, yeah.
My
Appreciate it.
name is Benjamin Berg. I'm not a professional or academic in this field. I'm a software developer. Really good speech. I really like the. I have one question on conspiracy theories. So there was this multiple pronged aspects of sharp power, and we know how governments defend themselves against them. They, how they defend against military attacks. We know how they defend against corrupt money, spy. We know how, like, and maybe focus on the Central European and Eastern European governments. Assume they're willing to defend against conspiracy theories. What are the mechanisms? How do they do that? That's actually is not counterproductive. Like, for example, I know there's a banning thing, which maybe has productive sides, but it can also be counterproductive because it plays right into the other guy's hand that see they don't want you to hear that. There's something to hide. So they understood. So do you know how they actively protect against?
You raise really easy, all of you
Gotta
raise
bring-
really easy questions for
We
me.
gotta bring Jacobiando. Huh?
So,
Remember him?
the thing is that
He's good at it.
so the thing is that yes, I think if you want to do things against conspiracy theories, you can do quite a lot of things. Problem is the biggest in countries where there are political forces who are amplifying that. I mean, if the government, for example, spreads conspiracy theories and you want as an NGO to debunk that and so on, it's like trying to put off a forest fire with a water pistol. I mean, I do think that honestly, removing it would be a good idea just from a cognitive psychology perspective. So cognitive psychology tells us that if you meet disinformation and conspiracy theories, it will have an impact on your thinking, even if you disagree or you think to disagree. People have a tendency to then everyone thinks that, of course, I'm not falling prey of disinformation, of conspiracy theories. Everybody does to a certain extent. So the best prevention would be just to clean the information space from that, but it would be pretty Orwellian. So it is like in free and open societies, we have to tolerate a certain extent of crazy ideas, and who defines what is crazy? So, and of course, if it's deadly dangerous, then you have more arguments. I do support, for example, policies of Facebook, which they implemented them properly, of remove anti-vaxxer content, for example, because it's deadly dangerous disinformation, or inciting hatred against Ukrainians, or Jews. I mean, we know it from history, and we see it now that it can be genocidal. So deadly dangerous, but in more one can think about lizard man and 9/11 conspiracy theories. Of course, you can't ban them, and you shouldn't. What the social psychology literature tells us, and I think as an education tool is pretty important, is that you can't remove all the harmful content, and you shouldn't. Therefore, you have to vaccinate people against disinformation. So it means that in the education, probably the most important conspiracy theories, you have to bring them in the classrooms and talk about them. ask the students, okay, why do you think it might be probably wrong? And let's involve them into the debunking, and the more active they will become, the better it is. When I do think, for example, that when it comes to science education, pseudoscience should have a higher, let's say, role in that. I mean, when everybody knows these science classes, 5 principles of science and methodology and so on. I mean, students go bored immediately when you try to define, let's say, scientific methods against homeopathy or against anti-vaxxers and so on. I mean, it just raises more interest. So this logic of vaccination is that you should have to be inoculated with the dangerous ideas if you want to be immune. I think it's pretty much right. And there are a lot of good tools. University of Oxford researchers have invented many good short videos on let's say, that introduce you to the logic of conspiracy theories and disinformation, black and white thinking and so on. And also there are brilliant games such as the bad news, which is about that you are becoming the disseminator of disinformation. You have to be the propagandist, and let's try how well it works, how efficient you can be if you destroy the reality. And I think all these approaches are way more realistic than calling for social media companies to remove all the harmful content. It just will never happen. And of course, I think it's important I'm not against content moderation, but we have to be realistic and we have to avoid an Orwellian approach of let's remove everything that we don't like, because it can be pretty well abused by authoritarians.
There's already, you can make a living already by, I was cancelled, so I'm like the most cancelled person.
Yes. Yeah, of course. And the last point is that, of course, I mean, the conspiracy theories can breed because there's a huge mistrust towards the governments in the West. I mean, we can tell to politicians, be more trustful, I mean, do your job better. And probably some of the mistrust, and it's connected to one of the previous questions, some of the mistrust might be justified. Of course, not that politicians are conspiring with aliens so that occupy the earth, but some conspiracy theories about politicians are just representing the, let's say, interest of the big business. It might have particles of truth. So I think there's some naive, but more transparency, more democratic accountability, and I mean, politicians who are perceived to be willing more for the will of the public. I mean, it might undermine and let's say better working public services. It might be able to destroy some of the mistrust.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think on that note, we'll call it a day. And I would like to thank Peter for coming. And Peter's going to visit again, I promise you. This is, as I said,